Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Depending on where you are, we have our online participants also today. For this, we have anticipating this big event for long. Every year, we can only have one. I just want to welcome everyone to CIES 2023. How lovely we can receive all our guests domestically and internationally. This is after the pandemic, our gathering in San Francisco. We haven't seen such a vibrancy and dynamism like this with over 3,000 participants. Thank you very, very much to join us this year. It's such a joy to welcome everyone. By the way, my name is Jin Lee. I'm serving as the conference chair and the president-elect. Before I invite our president and our chair, I just want to acknowledge our sponsors and also the partnership institutions. So please allow me to read out American Institutes for Research, Childhood Education International, FHI 360, UNESCO Future of Learning and Innovation, UNESCO Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Education for Peace and Sustainable Development, University of Pittsburgh, Western University, Chemonics International, NORAC, Network for International Policies and Cooperation in Education and Training, English Language Program, the US Department of State, and Mathematics. Thank you, thank you, thank you, our dear sponsors. Thank you. I'm extremely honored to have this opportunity to introduce our chair, Dr. Carly Mannion. To many of you, you don't need my introduction. She has been so active and taken many leadership roles in our community. But I still want to use this opportunity to introduce her in a more formal way. Dr. Carly Mannion is an associate professor and director of the Comparative International Development Education Center at the Ontario Institute for the Studies of Education at the University of Toronto. She has been focusing on many critical areas, especially social justice issues, gender issues, and her interest in research has been very wide, like in the West Africa, East Africa, East Asia, and of course, North American continent. She also serves as institutional representative of SADC to the UN's Girls' Education Initiative's Global Advisory Committee. She has widely published. I wouldn't read out the list. I just want to save a little bit of time for her chairing and also for our dear president. So Carly, please.
Hi, everyone. What an honor to be invited to chair Professor Baily's presidential address. I'm delighted to be here. In the lead up today, when I've shared what I'll be doing, everyone I've spoken to has pretty much the same words, and that is, Supriya is amazing. It was no difficult task to prepare my short remarks. The only challenge has been to rein myself in, because I realized I could easily spend the whole time sharing with you her many accomplishments and incredible contributions to the field of comparative and international education. Supriya's synergistic contributions to the field of CIE as a scholar, activist, and educator have had a profound effect on my own professional and personal development and that of many others. In her research, her dedication to service and advocacy beyond the academy, and exemplary and award-winning teaching record, Supriya truly demonstrates excellence in all that she does. The breadth and quality of her international, comparative, and development education scholarship is impressive, to say the least, with Supriya's areas of expertise including gender, nationalism, and political representation in gendered relationships, teacher education and professional development, community empowerment, non-formal education, youth and education, qualitative research methods, higher education access in developing countries, social justice, which I see as a real foundation from which she operates, peace education and education in post-conflict situations for vulnerable populations. And these areas of expertise are reflected in Supriya's extensive publication record, including multiple edited books and a long list of articles and book chapters, as well as many invited speaking engagements in the US and internationally. Supriya has given so much to CIES, and we truly owe her a debt of gratitude for her extensive and high-energy leadership and service to our society over more than a decade. I met Supriya when I attended my first Gender and Education Standing Committee meeting long ago. She was serving as the program coordinator, and then the following year she began a 3-year term as the GEC co-chair. So what an auspicious occasion it was to meet Supriya, and I simply cannot emphasize that enough. It's no exaggeration to say that she has been pivotal in inspiring my own active engagement with and service to CIES. She leads by example, and her commitment to this society is compelling. Indeed, it was largely because of Supriya, as I say, that I got involved with the GEC, first as secretary, and then later following in her footsteps as GEC co-chair. And if it's not obvious, she is not an easy act to follow. Supriya is as interested as she is interesting. Speaking from my heart, I credit her with inviting me in, as she has so many others, making us feel like we belong and that we have valuable contributions to make. And I've come to understand and deeply admire collegiality, encouragement, and mentorship are guiding principles at the core of her being. Supriya models professionalism and brings integrity to every space that she's part of, something that I've observed and experienced consistently throughout the decade plus that I've had the pleasure of working with her in various contexts and on a range of activities. She has, in addition to her work with the Gender and Education Committee, also served as the CIES Treasurer, the chair of the Finance and Investment Standing Committee. She's been a member of the Publications Committee. And this is not an exhaustive list, of course, but just some highlights. And she has, beginning in 2020, been serving as Vice President, President-elect, and now President. And I unfortunately was not able to attend the conference in Minneapolis last year, but I heard rave reviews. So thank you, Supriya. Thank you for all that you've done to strengthen and expand the good work of CIES and to make our society an attractive and rewarding professional home for all. Now for the main event, please give a warm welcome to our CIES President, Professor Supriya Baily.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Carly. That was beyond kind, and I'm a little not sure how to move past. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Good morning still. It's good to see you all. Those lights are very bright. It's my absolute pleasure to be here with you all today, and all right, PowerPoint's up. So, give me 5 seconds. Thank you. This is intimidating. Good morning, everyone. As I stand here to deliver this address, I really cannot look across this room and not see the familiar faces that have meant so much to me over the last many years. People who've supported me, who've challenged me, whose work has inspired me, and those of you who will continue to inspire and challenge us in the best of ways. I cannot begin this address without acknowledging first how much the society has provided to me intellectually, personally, and professionally over the years, and how grateful I am to so many of you who have done so much to enrich my life. So please, thank you so much. The title of this address is Reclaiming Idealism in a Hyper-Political Global Landscape, the Power of the Comparative. No doubt, some of you will recall the theme from the 2022 conference in Minneapolis, Illuminating the Power of Idealism. Those of you who know me well would not be surprised to see this logo one more time. I truly must have pasted it on everything. And like Marie Kondo would say, it brings me joy. This address is an extension of that theme, playing with idealism in time, place, and possibility, as articulated in the call for proposals for the 2022 conference, and now honed to share with you some thoughts on how we as a global community of comparativists, internationalists, educationalists, might need to set out to reimagine and reclaim idealism. In the development of this theme, and after, I have wondered a great deal about how to sustain idealism in troubled times. These thoughts have fed other explorations and thinking, both philosophically and practically. It's led me down a path of interconnected words, such as ideas, ideals, ideologies. They are all linked, but they do go down different paths. And this address, as a result, is my exploration grounded in theory, research, and practice, but also draws from my work as a scholar, an activist, and a teacher over the past 3 decades. As a schoolgirl in India, the poetry of Sarojini Naidu was required reading. From her ability to tweak a phrase to illuminate a whole world, she also epitomized the naivete and idealism of youth. She wrote, "Children, ye have not lived. To you it seems life is a lovely stalactite of dreams, or carnival of careless joys that leap about your hearts like billows on the deep, in flames of amber and amethyst." It must have been those flames of amber and amethyst that led to some of my early forays in education. When I was 17, my friends and I started a very idealistic nonprofit in our hometown of Bangalore, India. CIES, or Child Relief in Serving Indian Society, was our ambitious effort at trying to create an organization that was somewhat similar to Big Brothers and Big Sisters in the United States, where we paired up college students with children in the multiple orphanages around the city. Yes, we had both a logo and a fundraising brochure, and at 17, I was determined to raise enough money to make it a state organization. Anyway, much of what we did was modeled on the idealism of youth, the belief that a utopia, as expressed by Isaiah Berlin in his book, The Crooked Timber of Humanity, was possible. A utopia, he defines, is a place that lives in a state of pure harmony, in which all of its members live in peace, love one another, are free from physical danger, from want of any kind, from insecurity, from degrading work, from envy, frustration, experience no injustice or violence, live in perpetual, even light, in a temperate climate in the midst of infinitely fruitful and generous nature. So at the ripe old age of 20, I retired from CIES, Okay, you're listening, see? I didn't put anyone to sleep just yet. At the ripe old age of 20, I retired from crisis, happy to leave it to younger and newer leaders. At 20, I was hired by the Times of India to be a traveling workshop consultant. How I got the job is a slightly different story, but there's a through line from the utopian explorations of a group of 17-year-olds to this experience 3 years later. So I was in my second year as an undergraduate student living in Bangalore, and I had wheels. So I had a 50cc TVS 50, and I was the youngest person working on this team of artists, scientists, and educators. And I was sure that I was in over my head, a feeling that continues to this day and excluding right now. This endeavor was exciting to be part of, balancing a principled view of education alongside a savvy business proposition. The Times of India, a national newspaper, was trying an experiment. Schools would contract with the newspaper to purchase daily copies of the newspaper for a few different grades. And they would allocate one class period of a week to the newspaper and education program. The newspaper would then send out every week a different workshop consultant to use the newspaper as a living textbook in the classrooms to teach the students something different, something outside the prescribed curriculum, something that might pique their interest in the curriculum, and some way that we were teaching subjects in slightly more of a creative and engaged way. Our task was also to use the newspaper as a living textbook and design our lessons using the daily headlines in the classroom. So each one of us 20 workshop consultants had a different topic. We had a scientist who would talk about math problems using the newspaper. We had a well-known stage actor who would use the newspaper to teach about theater. And we had a business person who was an effective public speaker who would use the newspaper to teach about public speaking. My job was to use the newspaper to teach about the United Nations, human rights, and disarmament. Each week, I was assigned to 2 or 3 schools, and within each school, I would have 3 or 4 different classes. That would equate to about 7 or 8 hours of classroom instruction per week. And I was paid about 100 rupees per hour, which I was spoiled enough those days to allocate to an ever-enlarging shoe collection. The part-time gig was great, but I really appreciated the opportunity and tried to take the job as incredibly seriously as I could. Each morning, I would scour the paper for articles that addressed issues related to peace, human rights, conflict resolution, or the United Nations. And I would design a lesson or 2, or sometimes even 3, depending on how many grades I was teaching that day. Without formal training, I started to understand what differentiation meant in a classroom. I learned that teaching, good teaching, required skills beyond having a depth of knowledge of just content. And I realized that in some cases, I was barely 3 years older than some of my students, and fostering a relationship, even in those 45 or 50 minutes, meant that I could have some kind of impact on their learning. There were dozens of schools that were part of this program in all corners of the city, from private gated institutions with a century of tradition behind them, to startup schools with first-generation students whose parents were aspiring to that middle-class dream of a city that was just starting to take off. Not only was I an idealist, but I was teaching a subject that I thought was aspirational. And I was working with students whose parents saw education as a perfect pathway to move forward and upward. So at 20, I fell in love with the idealism of education, and I was surrounded by messages that reiterated those values. The words of Rabindranath Tagore, the Bengali playwright, philosopher, poet, and social reformer, would reinforce the notion of idealism in education. He said, "Education means enabling the mind to find out that ultimate truth, which emancipates us from the bondage of dust and gives us wealth not of things, but of inner light, not of power, but of love. It's the process of enlightenment. It's divine wealth. It helps in the rationalization of truth." These sort of expectations of what education can be, can do, permeates across time and space. I would hasten to bet that nearly all of us here today came to this work out of a profound sense to do more, and the belief that we can make the world a better place, a utopia, guides us in our work. The belief that education knowledge acquisition, is part of a grander goal to transport not just the individual, but whole societies is also common. This is reiterated in the notion that education is grounded in the comparative. From Confucian ideas, where the purpose of education is focused more on social rather than individual development, Confucius argues that the moral values of education were ultimately related to governing and regulating social relationships to achieve self-cultivation first, family harmony, good order in the state, and finally peace in the empire. To Plato, who said, a proper cultural education would enable a person, even when young, and still incapable of rationally understanding why, rightly to condemn and loathe contemptible things, and then the rational mind would be greeted like an old friend when it did arrive. Al-Ghazali, who said, education should be in the service of society and bring people up with high moral standards. Pedagogy, he argued, concerns what is in its essence a human process, and this means that education cannot be properly practiced except through humility, careful listening, and the collaboration of people. To John Dewey, who argues that education is vital to the capable functioning of a democracy, that ensuring an equitable education for all classes of populations in the country promotes stability, and that progressive education also offers a balance between the notion of individuality and that of the communal good. And of course, Freire, whose aim of education is to break the culture of silence among oppressed and making conscientization among them in order to make them fully human. Freire believed that the goal of education should be the freedom to speak, to think, and act in an authentic way. There is a foundational sense there that education is an idealistic endeavor. Within our own community in CIES, many of us would resonate with Nellie Stromquist's view that those of us engaged in education, especially those of us in the social sciences and humanities, seek to promote social change, to develop political consciousness and a sense of social justice. Or more recently, UNESCO's compact with its futures of education, a renewed commitment to global collaboration in support of education as a common good, premised on a more just and equitable cooperation among state and non-state actors at local, national, and international levels. The principle of education as a common good is inextricably linked with global responsibility. So, those of us here, I'm presuming, tend to believe strongly in many of these principles around social change, inclusion, equity, social justice, transformation. We are idealists as scholars, practitioners, policymakers, and students in this space. So, we might be idealists, but in our search for an ideal, things get a little more complicated. To me, the search for an ideal is something that's ingrained in how we as human beings frame our relationship with the world and with each other. We aspire towards an ideal. We govern towards an ideal. We teach towards an ideal. We mold ourselves towards that ideal. Yet what is often ignored is that our versions of the ideal are as diverse and as different as who we are as individuals. While there's no agreement on what that ideal could or would be, we seem to continue to move or be forced to move towards it, either because we feel like we must, or it's what those around us desire for us. This search for an ideal is a lifetime journey. It might be quite clear then that there's a dark side to this notion of the ideal, the underbelly in our quest to reach a more utopian vision of the future, with which we have to contend, yet too often ignore. To complete the Isaiah Berlin quote from earlier, which said this as it's been up there, and you saw that a few minutes ago, he ends by saying, the main characteristic of most, perhaps all utopias, is the fact that they are static. Nothing in them alters, for they have reached perfection. There is no need for novelty or change. No one can wish to alter a condition in which all natural human wishes are fulfilled. In analyzing the work of Hannah Arendt, Margaret Canavan says that Arndt, in her book, The Human Condition, speaks to the curious sterility of utopias within which there's an absence of any scope for initiative, any room for plurality. So while we might be aspiring towards an ideal, we tend to ignore that stasis is incomprehensible and that diversity must be accounted for. We must deal with both the dynamism of the times and the plurality of the world. We grow up to realize that we have a flawed relationship with the ideal, that the utopia itself is not utopian. So, existentially, impractically, and with futility, we aspire towards our own vision of an ideal, and the real world intervenes. In the presence of dynamic changes and the plurality of voices, our aspirations towards the ideal lends itself to further questioning, within which lies a surfeit of further questions. So, my work is grounded in the work around power and agency, and so the questions I ask myself tend to be ones that resonate with me related to those issues. So I started to ask myself a series of questions. First, whose ideal matters? If the ideal is immobile, frozen in sort of the Arctic wilds of our mind, or self-centered, wrapped up in the egocentricity of our own individuality, what then happens when we come face to face with alternate ideals? In seeking the ideal, we tend to forget that our own experiences ground our conception of what that ideal is. So my image of the ideal is very different from anyone else's image. And so this leads me to ask more questions. Am I so unable to see outside of my blinders that only I can define the ideal? How do I make place for what I see as the ideal for me, which then might not be the ideal for someone else? In what ways do I make space for alternate forms of ideals, ones that might push against who I am and what I believe in? What happens when we align morality with our understanding of what is the right ideal? So this brings me back to the quote by Nellie Stromquist: those of us engaged in education, do we seek to promote social change and a sense of social justice? How do we sit with contested and co-opted visions of what social justice is defined as by forces that we might not agree, or that we would argue with, are not in fact socially just? So, I told you there are 3 questions over here, and you're going to have to bear with me before we get into the sort of meat of things. If the ideal is not universal, and there are in fact both divergent and morally untenable differences in these between our visions for an ideal, is agency what counts? Amartya Sen defines agency as a person's ability to be free to do and achieve what they want in pursuit of whatever goals and values he or she regards as important. A person's agency cannot be understood without taking note of his or her aims, objectives, allegiances, obligations, and in a broad sense, the person's conception of good. While this is an all-encompassing definition, the notion to define good, again, can be morally compromising and left open to politically motivated definitions. Maybe a narrower definition. Naila Kabir frames agency in a more taut construct, where first she says human agency is central to the analysis of social inequality, as it draws attention to the ways in which structural constraints shape the distribution of livelihood options to differently positioned groups of men and women. And second, it's central to the social justice agenda because it's the human capacity for agency that drives the process of structural transformation. A more complex definition, but one that integrates the actions of the individual within the structures they occupy. More close to home, we've had an assortment of definitions of agency. Seberg defines agency as a core capability and concerns a person's ability to pursue goals she or he has reason to value. Murphy Graham and Leal argue that agency captures the idea that the capacity to act will differ at different times and in different places. And a shout out to Vilma Seberg and Aaron Murphy Graham, wherever you might be. Thank you. So I repeat my question. If the ideal is not universal, and in fact there are both divergent and morally untenable differences between our visions for an ideal, is agency what matters? Can I live with other forms of the ideal if my own agency to exist as I see fit is not curtailed by others? In having agency to live your life without infringing on others, if it does not violate the safety and security of others, does it make it easier to determine having your own ideal while someone else has theirs? But who defines those terms, all open to interpretation and abuse, if the values of the majority compromise the actions of the minority and vice versa? If there are divergent views of an ideal and your agency is what permits you to achieve your ideal, it leads me to the third and last question: who has the power to channel that agency? To be able to exercise our agency towards an ideal we believe in represents our version of reality. We have to be able to have power. Having power moves us towards a particular vision of the ideal that we believe we must meet. Without power to channel our agency, we're often forced to move towards someone else's vision of an ideal, which leads me back to the first question: whose ideal matter, and if I'm moving towards an ideal that I align with or not. So it's sort of this cyclical process, right? So working towards an ideal is like trying to design a Penrose staircase, of which can only exist in a two-dimensional space, in that if the ideal is extracted into the real world, it's further impacted by politics, economics, culture, religion, biology, astronomy, astrology, anything really, right? Infinite numbers of things can impact what that ideal might look like once it's been extracted and put into the real world. Our power and agency gets diluted the more the ideal is twisted and massaged to suit the structures and the systems in which we live. So the idea of the ideal, the agency we have to enact it, and the power that's in our hands to craft, frame, direct, or otherwise influence structural constraints and structural transformation are now particularly vulnerable in the current hyper-political global environment that we are living in. So, I'm not an historian, and I know many of you who are in this room, but from what I understand, each generation feels a sense of anxiety over the desolate landscape of the political environment, with maybe a few bright sparks interspersed now and then. It's a cyclical movement. Interspersed with that anxiety is a cyclical movement from where we're thrust from experiencing idealistic euphoria to debilitating disappointment. From the exhilaration of the 1920s to the devastation of World War II, from the perception of stability in the 1950s to the turmoil of the civil rights movements in the 1960s, from the violence of the toppling of colonial powers in the 70s to the jubilation of independence, from the rise of détente and the fear of Cold War to the subsequent opening up of communist states and the breakdown of the Soviet Union. Like a seesaw, we experience whiplash, moving from high highs to low lows. In light of those ups and downs, it's hard to say that this time is somehow worse, that this time the brink seems a little steeper. But without history's rearview mirror with which to give us some distance from the lived reality of the time, the precariousness feels much more present. In many ways, education seems to be at the center of much of the political tensions, percolating inside colleges and universities, facing attacks in the public square, and being galvanized for political purposes. To return to the Futures of Education report, international education cooperation operates within an increasingly precarious world order, and the notion of a world society anchored in common universal values is profoundly eroded. Non-state actors struggle to build lasting alliances and coalitions. Illiberal non-state actors are on the rise, even more capable of exploiting digital technologies and flows of information, and that work against the values inscribed in the United Nations Declaration for Human Rights and made explicit in the SDGs, both of which I would argue articulate visions of an ideal. So this brings me to the word ideology. This hyper-political global landscape is defined in many ways by increasing forms of expanding and encroaching forms of nationalism. Nationalism, in its broadest sense, refers to, and I quote, the sum of those beliefs, idioms, practices oriented to a territorially delineated nation. In a narrower sense, It's also defined as political ideology or doctrine whose object is an existing or envisaged nation state wherein cultural and political boundaries coincide. This definition appears to be almost sanitized, a rather value-neutral approach to a complex system of governance, legality, geography, and culture. Soon after World War II, historian and author Nicholas Hans describes nationalism with anger, especially in relation to the role nationalism played in the devastating events in Europe. He describes it as a feeling, a state of mind, resulting from social environment and education, a movement created by propaganda based on intentional misrepresentation of fact. This misrepresentation can cover much of what threatens those who are in power, from othering different religions, races, genders, ethnicities, to changing the narrative of electoral losses and media representation. A 2019 issue of Foreign Affairs, Jan Warner Muller of Princeton University uses the metaphor of the drawbridge up or the drawbridge down as a way to illustrate how nationalists think about national borders, specifically talking about the US in the post-Trump era. Sociologist Patrick Heller of Brown University makes the case that since World War II, there are a rising number of democracies that are increasingly showing authoritarian tendencies. He contends that these shifts are primarily due to the consolidation of power in an effort to either overtly or covertly weaken the basic legal and institutional conditions that support a constitutional democracy. Some of the next few slides have a couple of interesting snapshots of data that have been collected by the Pew Research Center around public perceptions around religion, nationalism, ethnicity, and nostalgia. Just briefly to go through them, this data resonates with me, particularly where Hindus in India say being Hindu and speaking Hindi is very important to being truly Indian. In this slide, you can see that 4 out of 10 US adults say that the US should be a Christian nation. But far fewer, while they do say they don't want the churches to engage with politics, you can see here that majority seem to think that the US was originally intended as a Christian nation, that it should be a Christian nation, and that number is rising, and that it's now a Christian nation. So there's some data over there. And then there's some other data that Pew Research Center collected around how people who seem to think the past was better are also oftentimes those who view populist political parties with much more appreciation, right, or look at them more favorably. And so you can see that in Germany, Sweden, France, and the Netherlands. So go back for a split second, stay here for a second. So the data tells us that people are moving towards sort of authoritarianism, nationalism, and part of this allows for political leaders, including Narendra Modi of India, to elevate right-wing nationalism and what some scholars are calling muscular forms of nationalism. I particularly have appreciated exploring this term. I've been working on a book the last few years that intersects rising misogyny with nationalism and religious fundamentalism. And the term muscular nationalism provides a framework that illustrates the intersection of the political and gendered components of nationalism in both stark and understandable ways. Muscular nationalism can comprise of partisan, exclusionary, self-interested beliefs about the nation, a hawkish determination to pursue those beliefs, and forceful and aggressive methods of actualizing those. Furthermore, the rise of such forms of nationalism are founded in the backlash to globalization, internationalization, and other forms of neocolonial practices that are seen as threats to forms of cultural, political, and religious hegemony, forces that are actively pushing back against the models and aspirations of the early 2000s. In her book, Muscular Nationalism, Gender, Violence, and Empire in India and Ireland, 1914 to 2004, Banerjee talks about the rise of muscular nationalism in India, arguing that such views of nationalism didn't emerge in a material vacuum. It unfolded in a context of political and economic anxiety, and it may have heightened the salience of armed masculinity and models of female behavior that are rooted in notions of chastity and purity. Failing industries, political stagnation, increasing unemployment, and growing inequities have created this anxiety as common folk saw the quality of their life suffering while the state failed to renew infrastructure and provide services. Against this context, armed masculinity, denoting action, resolution, and more important, the willingness to strike back and seize one's rightful share of the benefits, is an extremely powerful cultural construct. Muscular forms of nationalism have led to increased scrutiny by governments, and those who espouse to act on their behalf, think of the January 6th insurrectionists, by deputizing themselves as the protectors of the nation, they seek to take any action they deem they must to safeguard their beliefs. Education has become one of the most critical frontiers in the battle for supremacy, especially in spaces that are no longer just flirting with, but are wedded to forms of nationalistic, jingoistic, ethnocentric politics of division. Part of the willingness for people to move towards a nationalist ideology comes from the ways in which we structure education. Education is inherently a site of political engagement, but the current nationalist environment around the world, there's a political motivation to ensure that new philosophies, policies, and practices render education as a tool for compliance and conformity in supremacist governments. In a piece that I wrote for NAFSA on neo-nationalism, I argued that conformity and compliance in education made us more vulnerable to nationalistic ideologies. Conformity is expressed in how we strive to structure our curriculum, as well as the evolution of expectations from what learning must constitute, from how we design our proof of learning, to how we assess, how we report, and what we anticipate learning must look like. All of these are reflected from our youngest learners to our most advanced degrees. Conforming to a particular outcome and output helps an individual become that much more vulnerable to the rhetoric of nationalism and ideological rigidity. Compliance ensures that we create a structure of education that seeks to align systems and policies, people and organizations into a state of acquiescence. Avoiding challenging systems or aligning with the expectations set forth often allows for the amplification of the loudest voices. Compliance with rules that are not designed to meet the needs of our most vulnerable learners hastens the ability for those to take advantage. Compliance infused into educational systems also weakens the fabric of society, allowing for authoritarianism to take root. In their book, Susan Groundwater Smith and Nicole Mockler talk about the rise of an audit culture, the loss of subjectivity, and the increased creep of standardization. Why we do what we do in education has to do with increasing, some of why we do what we do in education has to do with increasing access and creating equitable models of education. So think about the ways in which we have to standardize curriculum in some ways, because otherwise you may have schools that predetermine that some students won't benefit from the curriculum and will be steered towards less academic subjects. So in some ways, that kind of standardization can be very helpful. But with the creep of standardization, there's also the ability for the state to ensure that the curriculum embodies what they believe is in the best interests of the student to learn and to be exposed to. And as a result, more complex and difficult to measure learning outcomes get left behind. A teacher's ability to teach critical thinking and a student's ability to think and act critically are diminished. This is not new information. In the very first issue of the Comparative Ed Review in 1957, James McClellan shared in his essay, An Educational Philosopher Looks at Comparative Education, what he said was a prosaic example. He talks about how IQ tests were originally developed and standardized to make it possible to predict a given student's probable success in a set academic curriculum. And he talks about how in England they used that to teach to the test to provide plum appointments for their students, for their schools. In the US, where selection was less severe, the IQ tests, he believes, became far too frequently a stick that teachers can hold over the head of a student whose performance is less than scientifically measured potential. And obviously this was what he assumed was not what Binet and his successors had thought about when they were developing the IQ tests. While McClellan talks about teachers holding students up to their potential, the expansion of testing and standardization is the equivalent of the educational arms race today. The neoliberal model that the top of the list is the best of the list holds little value when your students are being force-fed facts to prove a government's worth. To return to Isaiah Berlin, the idea of compliance creates an environment where those who live, where they accept without question and freely obey the orders of leaders, spiritual or temporal, whose word is fully accepted as unbreakable law, or those who have, by their own methods, arrived at clear and unshakable convictions about what to do and what to be that brook no possible doubt. I can only say that those who rest on such comfortable beds of dogma are victims of forms of self-induced myopia, blinkers that might make for contentment, but not for understanding of what it means to be human. Around the world, the ideological right has determined that education is the fulcrum around which their vision of the ideal rests. This vision of the ideal is predicated on the power now being held by the political right, which is increasingly expanding and as such dramatically shifting our vision of what education might be. Education is, and I quote, a strategic element to ensure the power of regimes to impose their ideologies and consequently to deepen social inequalities. From K-12 to higher education, and from the United States to Australia and back, there are corrosive and systemic attacks on education as a progressive space. Schools and educational institutions have always been areas that have been influenced by the demands of the national government. But for much of our history, that might have been small pockets of authoritarian regimes. But the growing popularity and the spread of nationalist governments has created a much more overt, direct, and expansive effort at ensuring that schools are vehicles for the propaganda of the government. From how we structure schools, the bathroom debates in the US, to the curriculum, almost everywhere, to student health, the vaccine debates, inaccurate arguments allow for misinformation to flow generously. In the US, the right has been successful at reframing issues of equity by dismantling access to education, by channeling public perceptions into a mythical war on merit, which is as flawed as our decades-long war on terror. This has also successfully pitted Asian Americans against other people of color and sanitizes claims of racism among those who would benefit from such intra-group tensions. In another rebranding effort, civics education has been dismantled to teach patriotic education. And public education has given way to the primacy of parental choice, inherent in which means that parental choice would not, in fact, include public education. One can only assume that this is because public education has been crafted in the image of the progressive foundations of Dewey and others whose values are currently counter to the current nationalist ideologues. These are ideological extremes that are couched in the vision of the ideal. Other ways that education continues to be battered in ideologically rigid environments include systematic efforts to deprofessionalize teacher education and the teaching profession. Weigel and Brandt argue that authoritarian regimes require a docile teaching force that stifles divergent opinions in the classroom. This is done by instilling fear in teachers and chipping away at their autonomy and demeaning their work through low pay and little respect. A teacher from India shared with me, secularism has gone for a toss and it's getting reflected in the teaching and learning process. Books are being rampantly changed and history is being rewritten, of course, by those who have the power. The textbooks which they use are being rewritten. The benchmark of what's being followed in the Indian curriculum have been revamped as per the wishes of the ruling powers. Stalwarts of the Indian freedom movement have been rubbed off the history books, and new unknown faces have replaced them. It's a predicament being a teacher at this juncture, having learned something else and having to teach just the opposite. A teacher in Bangladesh shared, many times I've been warned, you must actually stop lecturing. Stop discussing such things in the classroom with students. I've been told this by the principal. He stopped me. So I've told him I've done nothing wrong, okay? Simply, I just told them, telling the students to be rational, to be patient, to be logical. If logic is not there, then there's nothing. Simply, I'm making them logical. And I haven't told them to leave their religion. I haven't told them to be something different. They should decide what they actually want to do in their lives. That can be anything. That can be education, that can be religion, that can be anything they'd like to perceive and do in their life. And so they warned me if I kept doing this, they would kill me. Two other strategies have been less visible in the mainstream playbook of conservative takeovers in education. This includes the notion of tapping into what's called educated acquiescence, which seeks to engage those who might be historically natural critics of nationalist ideologies to become supporters. In Elizabeth Perry's work in China, she explores how the authoritarian state extends an attractive package of privileges and benefits, social prestige, political influence, material goods, etc., to successful recipients of higher education in order to woo their support. By structuring academic activities in ways that promote the state's interest, by directing intellectual production into officially approved and rewarded outlets, discourages and disallows independent critique. In such situations, the academic space might serve as an anchor for authoritarian stability, rather than an engine of either revolution or democratization. Another strategy that's been central around systematic efforts has been to target diaspora populations, to reach not just first, but second generation members of the diaspora who might be willing to see their heritage country in a different light. So authoritarian regimes not only encourage their first generation to contribute to the development and building of the image building of the homeland, but also seek to engage young and or second generation diasporans through invitations to invest in, return to, or learn about their country of origin in a variety of ways. This seems to be particularly happening in spaces where the marginalized diaspora or second generation citizens don't feel like they are at home. And they appreciate the flexing of national pride since they're not seen as members of their own communities. And this is illustrated in the work of Joaquin Hut and Orela's work with North African residents of Paris, which is experiencing its own sort of deeper connections to nationalist ideologies. So as we wrap up, idealism, ideals, and ideologies. So what does that leave us with? Possibility. So bear with me for a second, right? Sorry, you've bared with me for a lot of seconds at this point in time, so I appreciate that. Thank you. But two things always get me into trouble. And so the first is, in my house, I think in every house, we ask ourselves, what's for dinner? And in my house, that sometimes can be a bit of a loaded question, because I will say every once in a while, in a kindly sort of a whiny tone, something interesting. Every once in a while, I'll show up at my stylist salon, and she'll say, so what are we doing today? And there, rather frustratedly, so the first time is whiny, the second time is frustrated, I'll say, let's do something different. And both of those times, that's not a good thing to say, because interesting and different don't mean the same things to them that it means to me. And so they're relative. That is the problem. They're relative. And such is our search for the ideal. So I think we need to forget the ideal. If we're playing tug of war, we just need to drop the rope. We're not going to convince people that our version of the ideal is right, any more than my stylist is going to tell me that a pixie cut is going to look great on me. It's not going to work. What we land up doing is compromising our values and our ethics to give ground to ideologues who are seeking to hold power and constrict agency. And yet, do we need to reclaim idealism? The title of this talk is a little bit of a red herring. I don't think we actually need to reclaim idealism, because I think we as a community hold that value quite dearly. And a few of you helped me out with this. Many of you scanned a QR code that my friends were sharing widely a couple of nights ago and answered 2 short questions for me. You might have not known this was for the talk, but in the responses, those of you who did submit, thank you very much, I really appreciate it. Almost 93% of you would say that you are either once in a while, often enough, or definitely an idealist. I don't know who the other 7% are, but I'm guessing they're not here right now. How did you all describe yourselves as idealists? People said, I believe utopia is possible. I believe in change. We need hope sometimes. I believe a better world is possible. And then one person said, define the concept. And so I really hope that person is here today. If you are, please come find me after this. So I don't think we need to reclaim idealism, right? I mean, I think that we have that here in this space. But I do think we need to reclaim our ideas. Walter McClellan, in his book on decoloniality, quotes Paulo Freire by saying, knowledge emerges only through invention and reinvention, through the restless, impatient, continuing, hopeful inquiry human beings pursue in the world, and with each other. What both Freire and McClellan are talking here are about praxis and flexibility and alliance building. By sharing our praxis, we're transferring knowledge. But what McClellan also says is that as we become more sophisticated and our self-organization becomes more complex, institutions such as governments become a tool to manage and control knowing. Right now, more than ever, governments are managing and controlling our knowing, and more often than not, those governments are seeking a static and uniform utopia, one that's devoid of dynamism and plurality, as we discussed in the beginning of the talk. Here, when I talk about flexibility, I'm not talking about trying to meet nationalist governments where they are, God forbid. I'm talking about being willing to be open to that invention and reinvention, and to move away from the rigid expectations of what shows, as I mentioned earlier, proof of learning. As more governments move towards authoritarianism, their goals for education will be very different from those of us who value the words of Dewey and Stromquist and others who've talked about a more aspirational form of education. As such, we must start to question if our responsibilities are to the individual learner or to the nationalist governments with which might be looking for a different result. Finally, alliance building is critical because we seem to be splintering more than ever. The war on merit has pitted groups of people of color against each other because of that access to limited resources. The number of crises are vast and our attention is easily diverted. Right-wing, populist, and/or supremacist groups, pick your term, are coalescing. Building positive, hopeful, and supportive alliances that don't discount the threat is vital. But we must also be aware of how governments are watching and working to dismantle efforts. In my own hometown of Bangalore, there are multiple instances of intimidation and violence, especially directed towards women who speak out. So, I wanted to be the first president who did this. So, for Harry Potter fans, you'll get this reference. For others, context clues hopefully should be enough. In Book 7, we know that everything is lost the moment Dumbledore follows Grindelwald's argument, advocating for the greater good. The instant we accept the argument of the greater good, I believe we're adrift. The greater good is where we go when our ethics are compromised, and it allows those who are in power to win. So this brings me back to the content of the first 3 questions I posed at the start of the talk, namely the intersections of the ideal with agency and power. Agency is an overappreciated word in our field, and gender scholars and specialists particularly grasp the nuance of the word. Yet, as it's absorbed by multilateral institutions, big donor organizations, and others, there becomes a need to define parameters, assign metrics, measure outcomes. All of those, in many ways, reduce agency to something that we must comply and conform with. We must push back against this slippery slope. By wanting to prove that our projects are successful, our research sound, our funders happy, our impact wide, we cater to the greater good. We must resist making decisions based on artificial measures of success. We must hesitate before we compromise with the educational industrial complex that pacifies governments by developing curriculum and textbooks that relegate the full scope of the story to invisibility. We must rethink our measures of success. Benchmarks can lie, and parity, as my colleague Hatla Holmarsdottir and I wrote a few years ago, will never define quality. But we must also engage relationally, as Heidi Ross said in her address in 2002 to this body after the traumatic events of 9/11. She said, negotiating, not negating the spaces between us by persistent, agile, and enduring care in our teaching and our research is the necessary and possible work we have before us. The slide towards authoritarianism comes because there's a void. And those with whom we fundamentally disagree are filling that void because those in power are crafting a narrative of loss, defeat, and devaluation. Hannah Arendt's work feels like required reading for our times, and it must be part of that whiplash I talked about earlier. But she talks about how every decrease in power is an open invitation to violence, if only because those who hold power and feel it slipping away from their hands, be they the government or the governed, have always found it difficult to resist the temptation to substitute violence for it. There are some professions where I think we're well able to shut our door and say, I don't do politics. I was trying to think of what those were, and I couldn't really rule anything out. Bakers? I don't know, that seems like a kind of a, thank you. Nurses, during and after COVID, impossible not to pay attention. I don't know, I thought of maybe CPAs. I don't know. But in any case, those of us in education, we cannot. And those of us in CIES absolutely must not. We have women fighting for access to education around the world, college students protesting for their rights everywhere, children exposed to insignificant and inaccurate information. If we don't stand in solidarity with those who are increasingly being marginalized by authoritarian governments, who will? Our actions might be modest or grand, soft or loud, but we must not remain inactive. We must engage in dialogue and not be subsumed by trying to prove we're making a difference, because then are we risking our own ability to include the plurality and diversity that must be represented, or are we so busy crafting our own static and homogeneous vision of utopia? So as I really wrap up, I would like to just say that our ideas are our possibility. And in these hyper-political times, we must ignore the search for the ideal, counter ideologies and ideologues who would co-opt and constrain our ideas, and we should act in the best interests of a representative, progressive, thinking, rational, and idealistic world. To draw one more time from Hannah Arendt, insert yourselves and make the world a little bit better. Thank you very much.